Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started with our presentation entitled Steal and Conceal the Invisible Wounds of Trauma. So my name is Dr. Elsen. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and a little bit about myself so that you can all get to know me and know kind of my perspective, or more so where I come from. And feel free, I love that someone already messaged in the group, feel free throughout the presentation to make comments, make any questions. I might refer to them if they're in application to what we're talking about, and I love interaction. So please, yes, feel free to use the chat. But a little bit about myself. So I grew up as a pastor's kid. And when I say that, some of you might already have some judgments of, oh, is she that type of pastor's kid that was rebellious and left the church? Was she the type that's like the Ellen White type, right? That was super conservative. My experience was a little bit different, and praise God for having a father who really included a lot of us, the children, in the understanding of what was going on in the church. And so a lot of times pastors try to shelter kids, rightly so, but my dad would actually let us know. And the reason why he did that is because he didn't want us to create resentment in our hearts. But what he did is that he would explain to us why people were doing certain things. So for example, as a PK, you often will see people attacking your father, attacking the family. And again, you could have that resentment or bitterness towards people. But my dad would say, you have to understand that hurt people hurt people. And he helped us to start understanding the why behind the actions. And so why I mention that is because talking today about trauma is you're going to recognize that trauma is really at the heart a lot of what we do, a lot of how we treat people, a lot of if we have any addictions and so forth. And so having an understanding and compassion towards people can help us not just for ourselves receive that compassion, but especially within the church to start receiving that healing. So steal and conceal the invisible wounds of trauma. So let's just start off with why talk about trauma, right? I think the better question is actually why don't we talk about trauma? And so the reason why we're talking about trauma is because we don't talk about trauma. As a society, as church, as individuals, right? Now, before I continue, this is going to be a rhetorical question, so please do not answer in the group chat. How many of you here have experienced trauma? Again, rhetorical question. Don't want you to answer, but I want you to think about and reflect. Have I experienced trauma? Right? Now, this could be physical trauma, sexual trauma, emotional, psychological, right? Many different forms of trauma. Now, this is not going to be a rhetorical question. What percentage of people, whether present here, I don't know how many exactly are present, but if you were all to guess, what percentage of people here present in this Zoom presentation has experienced trauma? Do you think it's 10%? Do you think it's 20%? 50, 70? I want to see kind of what are you thinking? How many people here? Okay, already somebody says 85%. Okay, any other thoughts? How many people, what percentage? 100%. Okay, we have two people saying 100%. At least 50%, another 100. Yep, several 100%, right? And I think, as we talk about trauma, you'll see kind of some of the statistics, but I want you to think about that because often when we look at people, we don't see trauma, right? That's why today's presentation is emphasizing the invisible wounds of trauma. But it's important to think how many really of us have experienced trauma. So this whole presentation is going to be basically talking about why we don't talk about trauma and basically why we should. So the first point of why we don't talk about trauma is this delusion of the minority. So we're going to talk about statistics. So we think that it's the minority. Oh, only a few people have experienced trauma, or because we think trauma of like PTSD. Oh, I don't have PTSD, but there's a delusion that it's the minority when it's actually the majority. So here are a couple statistics. More than 2/3 of children reported at least one traumatic event by age 16. 2/3. 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 6 boys abused before the age of 18. Now I want to pause for a second. So you might say, oh, that's not 100%. 2/3. And you have to remember that with childhood trauma, not all trauma is reported. So 2/3 is already a really big number. But in addition to that, you think about how many children didn't report their trauma. 1 in 3 girls, 1 in 6 boys, that's huge. 26% of children in the US will witness or experience a traumatic event before they turn 4. So that it's happening very, very early on. A report of child abuse is made every 10 seconds. So think about how many 10 seconds there are in this whole presentation. How many child abuse reports are taking place? Every 9 minutes, a child is sexually assaulted. In 2019, about 1,840 children died of abuse and neglect in the United States, 5 children every day from child abuse. So why I included the statistic, it's not just trauma in the sense where we think, okay, something happened to the child and they'll recover. Children are resilient. Now, these are so severe that even to the point of death. Some of you may have heard of the trial of Gabriel Fernandez. There was a docuseries on Netflix about this child. And it was a fascinating case because it was the first time when social workers were actually put on trial and found guilty for not doing their job in protecting a child. He died from abuse. So children are dying from severe abuse and neglect. 4 in 10 children in America say they've experienced a physical assault. So you see that there's a mix. There's sexual trauma, there's physical. Each day, more than 1,000 youth are treated in the emergency department for physical assaulted related injuries. And now I know that often the statistics emphasize type B traumas. Type B traumas are trauma that bad things happen to kids, right? Or to anyone really, but bad things happening. But there's also type A traumas, which is the absence of good. So if you think about if a child is malnourished, right, they're lacking food. But I often refer with my clients when I work with them, I say, you are emotionally malnourished. A child needs love and kind words and support and nurturing. And so a lot of kids are not included in these statistics, but they also suffer from type A trauma, the absence of good. And now a lot of these statistics also do not include, are not considering COVID. So with COVID, with the pandemic, the rates of abuse skyrocketed. In the chat, anyone have an idea of why do you think the rates of child abuse skyrocketed during the pandemic? Well, both child abuse as well as domestic violence. Any thoughts? Why do you think these stats went up? The rates went up during the pandemic for abuse. People have more idle or free time, definitely. Stress, anxiety, being home more. Family members are spending more time at home, yeah. Spending more time with each other, right? So imagine, not being able to go out and relieve some of that stress. So it's all inside the home. And also there's an element of secrecy, right? Things happen in the home, and if a child goes to school and the teacher sees the marks, but then the child is at home, right? So parents are stressed and taking it out on the kids, definitely. There's many different reasons, but these statistics, right, are alarming, but think about how much more in the context of the pandemic. Now here are a couple more now, focusing more on adult trauma. 70% of adults experience at least one traumatic event in their lifetime. So not quite 100%, but again, with trauma, it's very sensitive, and we'll talk about shame and the silence it creates, that often take these statistics and round dramatically up, right? Because not everyone reports their trauma. Now, about 6 of every 10 men and 5 out of every 5 of 10 women. And then just there's a description that men and women often experience different types of trauma. Every 73 seconds, an American is sexually assaulted. 1.3 women are forcibly raped each minute. Yikes. In the US, 78 an hour, 1,870 per day, 683,000 per year. You might think to yourself, of all the women I know, how many have been raped? And you might maybe know 1 or 2, but my guess is that there are many more, but they just haven't shared it with you. There are a lot of women and men. Someone commented lots. Yeah, a lot of people. 20 people per minute are physically abused by an intimate partner in the US. And that's one thing that also happens with trauma is a lot of times the perpetrator is somebody close to you. And so that's even more shame inducing and you don't want to share, right? So intimate partner violence is very, very common. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 9 men experience severe interpersonal violence. And that's very scary because we know that that creates a cycle. When a person's abused, then they're at a higher risk, not guaranteed, but at a higher risk to transmit some of that violence into their future relationships. 1 in 13 people will develop PTSD at some point in their life. So not everybody who experiences trauma will develop PTSD, but PTSD is a common diagnosis. So why are we talking about trauma? For one, we need to start realizing it's not the minority, it's the majority, right? It's the majority of people. And so some of you who had said, 100%, right? It's very close to that in the sense that trauma is very, very common. We don't realize how many people how many they're actually experiencing trauma. So there's the first point, the illusion of the minority. The second point of why we're talking about trauma is because there's an exclusion of the severity. So we think that, okay, if people do experience trauma, then maybe it's not that bad. People are resilient, but the impact of trauma is severe. So I'm going to go through a biopsychosocial spiritual approach of looking at how it impacts every aspect of our life. So I'm going to start with the most obvious, the psychological. This is probably what people are most aware of, that people who experience trauma are at higher risk of mental illness. They're 3 times more likely to experience depression. Now look at this one, 15 times more likely to attempt suicide. When people have experienced trauma, they're 15 times more likely to attempt suicide. 4 times more likely to become an alcoholic, 2.5 times more likely to smoke, increased rates of comorbid mood, personalities, psychotic and other disorders. And here's kind of a general overview of trauma doubles the risk of developing mental illness and triples the risk of developing a serious mental illness. And then we'll talk a little bit about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. When people have 4+ experiences, negative experiences in childhood, they're 7.3 times more likely to have a mental illness. And somebody in the chat's asking, what exactly is the definition of trauma? Trauma, kind of like what I was referring to, type A, type B, there's not a great definition of trauma. When it comes to PTSD, often what we reference is if you've been exposed to or witnessed a life-threatening event, but that definition doesn't fully capture the scope of trauma, because let's say for a child to be physically abused, you might say, oh, well, that child is being hit, but it's not life-threatening. And yet we see that even if it's not life-threatening, they can still have the impact and the effects of trauma, including, for example, in trauma research, there's a debate of whether or not a miscarriage is a trauma, because there is a death, right? But depending on how you view the issue of life, some people don't consider it a trauma, but those who've experienced it have. So there's not a great definition of trauma, but trauma can include both negative things happening to us, right? As well as the absence of good. Now, some of you may be familiar with this. This is Dr. Neil Nedley's hit hypothesis where there's 10 main hits of that risk factors basically that can increase your likelihood of developing mental illness. And I'm not going to go through this in depth, but you notice that there's genetics. If you have a predisposition towards developing mental illness, developmental can include childhood experiences, lifestyle, circadian rhythm, addiction, nutrition, toxins, grief, medical conditions, and your frontal lobe having like reduced activation and functioning. So all of these, they typically say if you have 4 or more, you are at a high risk of developing mental illness. But what's fascinating about trauma, so trauma would be categorized under the second one, childhood trauma, is there's actually a bidirectional relationship that yes, trauma is a risk factor for mental illness, but trauma can actually impact every one of these hits. Trauma impacts, and I'll talk briefly about this, the genetics. It impacts the way that you live your life. It impacts your ability to sleep well. It often leads to addiction. It impacts your nutrition. So it impacts every one of these. So really in this forum, Love in the Making forum, we're talking about the heart of the matter. Big component of the heart of the matter, the core of a lot of the things we're struggling with is trauma. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the biological component. How does trauma impact our biology? Now, this is fascinating. This is talking about childhood trauma specifically. But one way is that it changes our hormones. And so there's an elevated and prolonged elevation of cortisol and adrenaline in the blood. Now, if you think about when you see a bear or when you see some sort of danger, right? Adrenaline, cortisol, other hormones are being pumped through your body to prepare you for danger. That's good. You want to have that because then it's, do I stay and I fight the bear? Do I take off running? That adrenaline helps you prepare for that danger. But the problem with trauma is that often what happens is that there's elevated levels of those hormones. And those high levels of hormones keep your blood pressure elevated. It weakens your heart and circulatory system. It keeps your glucose levels elevated as well, which can lead to type 2 diabetes. It disrupts your immune system, your inflammatory response system. And so thinking also about the impact of trauma in COVID, if your immune system is lower, right, which I'll talk about in the second point as well, you're also more likely to have a cold and to have severe COVID symptoms and so forth. It can also lead to lupus, multiple sclerosis, osteoporosis, which I find fascinating because Proverbs 17:22, we often quote the first part of that verse. Does anyone know that verse? Proverbs 17:22. A joyful heart is good medicine, but we don't often quote the last part. But a broken spirit dries up the bones. That's actually very scientific. When you have a broken spirit, right, you don't have a good mental health, that can actually lead to osteoporosis, dries up the bones. So the Bible is way before its time, right? But they can see that there's even a link between trauma, osteoporosis, and other physical health conditions. Also, with immune system changes, you notice that it's linked to thymus involution, basically shrinkage of the thymus, as well as atrophy of the spleen and lymph nodes. So all of these are important for immune functioning. Telomere shortening, which can lead to early and premature death, and increased stress hormones, as I mentioned in the first point, and overall an increase of inflammation, which we know that depression and other mental illness is because of it, inflammation, and impairment of immunity. And if we need our body, if you think about also with cancer, right? Our body has the immune system to fight off, right, cancer and illness and other things. And so if it's weakened, then we're not able to fight off those dangerous physical illness. Now, there's also, this is fascinating, neurological changes. So this is, I find this absolutely fascinating. You can see here kind of 3 main parts of the brain that I'm going to emphasize, but overall, there's a reduced neural connections in the frontal lobe. Now, does anyone know what is the frontal lobe responsible for? What is the frontal lobe responsible for? Reasoning, okay. What else? Decision making, yep. Several people, decision making. And not just decision making, which is, yes, a key component of it, but moral decision making. So knowing how to make, what is right, what is wrong. It's also considered the seat of morality in regards to where we connect with God the most. So I like to think if our body is the temple of the Holy Spirit, our frontal lobe is the most holy place. That is where we connect with God. We make good decisions, we make bad decisions. That place, that frontal lobe is like the CEO of our brain. So why is that important when it comes to trauma? Trauma, there's reduced neural connections. The frontal lobe is weakened. So think about the impact of that. People are not going to be able to make as great of decisions. They're not going to be able to connect with God as deeply as they want to and can. And not only is this reduced, but you notice it also says the other pathways in the survival parts of the brain are strengthened. So you notice there on the picture, hippocampus and amygdala, those are very close together. Hippocampus is typically known for the storage of memory. So they say if you saw a hippo on campus, you'd remember that, right? The hippocampus is responsible for memory. And then the amygdala is primarily responsible for the fear response. And so what happens is there creates this imbalance in our brain. Our frontal lobe helps regulate our emotions. It helps basically keep the amygdala in check. If you saw a stick and you start freaking out and you're like, oh, it's a snake. The frontal lobe will be like, no, that's a stick. You're fine, calm down. And the amygdala calms down. But with a trauma brain, what happens is the amygdala is hypersensitive and the frontal lobe is not able to regulate it. It's basically like the brakes. It doesn't put the brakes on for your emotions. And so this is when people are highly emotional and they have difficulty regulating their emotions and they start perceiving life as more dangerous than what it is because of the neurological changes. Now, the last point of how it impacts our biology is that it also changes our epigenetics. Now, for those of you who are familiar, epigenetics is the study of how basically experiences, things that we do, our environment can alter our genes. That's insane. We think that we're just born with certain genes and that's it. But no, we have the ability through our environment, through our behaviors, through our choices to turn on and turn off certain genes. Now, when it comes to trauma, right, unfortunately, this can alter the genes that basically turning on certain genes that can increase our likelihood of having mental illness, addiction, and physical diseases. And so you see that the impact of trauma on even our physical health is very, very significant. So here's just a summary of the different types of physical disorders that people can experience. Just a quick kind of case. I had a client who she was, in her late 70s. She was being treated for seizures for decades, and the medication and other treatments were not really working. And they did a study and they looked at her brain activity while she was having this seizure-like activity, and they realized this is not epilepsy. The way that the brain is firing is not like epilepsy. And so her neurologist thought for a second, well, what if this is related to her trauma? And the reason why is he realized that it's possible. It's possible to, which I'll talk about in a little bit, for the body, right, to react to trauma. And so he decides to send her to my office. Now, he was confused. He thought that I was a psychiatrist. So he thought she'd come see me, get some medication, and see that if that would help at all with these symptoms. And as I assessed her, this woman had a long history of multiple sexual abuse incidents. And she was like, I was fine when I went to college. I put it all behind me. I stuffed it down. I lived my life. And she said, I had no concerns. Then all of a sudden, she got married. She was still fine. She had her son. She was still fine. And then she had her daughter. And she started to have back pain. She started to have seizures. And she started having other physical complaints. Now, I want you to think about, why do you think that is? Why do you think that at the birth of her daughter, she started having these physical complaints? And the reason why is because the daughter was a reminder, it was a trigger of her trauma, because she was a helpless young female child. And so she was now scared that her daughter would be also a victim. And so what we're talking about, some of you may be familiar with this book. It's called The Body Keeps the Score. And it talks about how trauma is not just a psychological, memory and experience. Our body, if not healed from your trauma, your body keeps the trauma. And so there are many, many cases. I used to work in primary care settings. They integrate psychologists into primary care settings because they understand that a lot of people are coming to the doctor for physical complaints when it's actually psychological. And this is not too far from Ellen White in Spirit of Prophecy also says 9 out of 10 diseases start in the mind. The mind and the body are so connected that if you don't heal the mind, your body will keep the score. Now, going back to the case I mentioned, calling her Linda, her name's not really Linda, but Linda then comes and I do an assessment. I tell her, I don't prescribe medication, but I can help you work through your trauma. And I do cognitive processing therapy, which is basically like CBT for trauma. And part of the CBT for trauma is writing the trauma, exposing yourself to the trauma, and rewriting your narrative to your trauma. And it's amazing that the moment she confronted her trauma, what do you think happened? The symptoms got worse. And you're like, whoa, Katie, why are you having her do that if the symptoms got worse? Because we use this analogy in trauma treatment is if you break your wrist, let's say, and you're like, okay, it looks like this. I actually broke my wrist. And you're like, okay, I don't want to deal with the pain. So trauma happens. You're like, I don't want to deal with it. I just want to, keep moving forward. And that's the main way people do, they address their trauma. Just ignore it. What happens if I don't go see the doctor? What happens to my wrist? It gets worse. So what happens is it heals, right? But it heals incorrectly. So yes, somebody said it may heal deformed. The bone heals improperly. So it does heal, but it heals improperly. And because it heals improperly, you have the illusion of healing, but you have constant pain. So a lot of people, they ignore their trauma, they don't get help, and they're like, I'm good. On the outside, I'm good. Invisible wounds. The wounds have apparently healed, but they haven't. And we have this underlying pain. So what do you need to do in order to get rid of that pain? Any idea? What do I do with my wrist? It healed, but healed incorrectly. Maybe has a little deformity here. What do I do to get rid of that pain? Somebody says, re-break it. Yes, you go to the doctor and the doctor has to re-break it. And so going back to Linda, I told her, I said, it often gets harder before it gets better. And so her symptoms, when we confronted her trauma, got worse. And that's a big reason why people are like, I don't want to deal with it. But what do you think happened after she confronted her trauma and started to process her trauma? What happens after they reset it? It gets better. True, I love somebody just posted true healing. Yes, there's a false healing, and we'll talk about Satan and how he promotes this false healing. But God desires for us to have true healing. And praise God that Linda is receiving true healing, and her seizures and her physical complaints are actually reducing. The body keeps the score. So this is from the book by Dr. Wessel van der Kolk. It says traumatized people chronically feel unsafe inside their bodies. The past is alive in the form of gnawing interior discomfort. Their bodies are constantly bombarded by visceral warning signs. And in an attempt to control these processes, they often become expert at ignoring their gut feelings and in numbing awareness of what is played out inside. They learn to hide from themselves. But let me ask you this, can you really hide from yourself? Right? You play hide and go seek with yourself? It doesn't work. You can't hide from yourself. Invisible wounds, but they're still wounds. They're still there. And so that's the biological component. But then there's also the social. People are 3 times more likely to be absent from work. They have higher unemployment rates, poverty, Medicaid use. They have 2 times more likely to have serious financial problems, higher risk of intimate partner violence, higher divorce rates, have fewer healthy relationships. What we often see is also they have more isolation, they withdraw more, they have difficulty relating to other people, difficulty expressing or managing their emotions, which then gets in the way of having healthy relationships, and increased risky behavior, including sexual behavior. Now, I hope all of you are, as you understand more about trauma, this is going to help you increase your empathy towards other people. So we might see the sexual behavior, let's say, especially in the church. Oh, so-and-so, right, is living with her boyfriend. So-and-so, but if we understand that often this is a result of trauma, it's not to, of course, say, oh, it's okay, but it's saying, I can understand that hurt people do things, right, that they don't even want to do. Now, what's also fascinating is because of trauma, we're often hurting people that didn't hurt us. I love this quote. It says, if you don't heal what hurt you, you'll bleed on people who didn't cut you. And this is so true. I see this all the time in church, right? We're hurting each other. We're arguing with each other. We're blaming each other. We're accusing each other. And not because we're actually mad at each other, it's because we often have our own invisible wounds, right? Hurt people, and we're bleeding on people that didn't hurt us. And maybe if you've experienced trauma, maybe you've recognized this. Maybe you're like, man, I just lashed out on my spouse, or I just, said something harmful or hurtful to a church member, and you didn't mean to. But we naturally will bleed on people who didn't cut us if we don't heal. And then the last way that it really impacts us, and this is really sad, and this is what I often see with my clients, is that the trauma often results in a loss of faith. So research shows that there's diminished participation in religious and spiritual activities. There's a loss of meaning and purpose for living. There's feelings of being abandoned or punished by God. Changes in fundamental beliefs, which I'll talk about a little bit later in my presentation. As a clinician, one of the most rewarding aspects of my job is I offer to pray with every single patient. And I've had many, especially trauma patients who are like, I don't, like, either they identify as atheist or agnostic, and it's because of their trauma. And the reason why I offer to pray with them is not to give them this superficial, we have like these Band-Aid interventions as Christians. It's not to pray for the sake of prayer, is to show them that, as Ellen White says, that prayer is the opening of your heart as to a friend. So when I pray with them, it's to show them that God that they think that they know as a result of trauma is not the God that God is. And so they have a misunderstanding of who God is. And that is really at the core of what Satan intends to do through trauma. Someone here says those feelings of loss of faith, especially when it happens at church or with Christians, 100%, 100%. Because we often, and this is what I really appreciate about my dad and how he raised me, he said, Katie, never attribute to God of what his children do, right? God is perfect. His children are imperfect. And often, naturally, we think, oh, if somebody hurts me in the church, that's a reflection of God. Like God is good all the time, even when his children are not a good reflection of him. So why do we not talk about trauma? The delusion of the minority, the exclusion of the severity. We don't really understand the true severity, but also the confusion of the complexity of trauma. So many of us are confused. So I'm going to talk briefly about the paradoxes of trauma. So these are just some of them to highlight, and whether you haven't experienced it or you have experienced it, you'll understand why this is a paradox. So often when we experience trauma, we want to banish it from consciousness, and yet the trauma refuses to be buried. So this is a paradox. You want to banish it, but it refuses to be buried. It's an unspeakable secret, and yet an unavoidable reality. When you experience trauma, you feel numb, and at the same time, you relive the event. You have sometimes a detached calmness, but also terror and rage. You can't stand the thought of others being harmed, and yet you explosively are angry and harmful to your family. You isolate, withdraw, push others away, and yet at the same time, desperately seek connection and anxiously cling to others. You're terrified of being alone, and yet also terrified of being with people. You have the will to deny what happened, and yet you try to proclaim it out loud. Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman. I highly recommend the book. I don't agree with everything, but she presents the basics of trauma very well. She says the conflict between the will to deny horrible events and the will to proclaim them aloud is central dialectic of psychological trauma. So what I mean by this is that often we don't talk about trauma because it's so confusing. It's like, I don't understand this person. They're like wanting to hang out with me, and then all of a sudden they like ghost me, right? Or they're like texting, and then all of a sudden they won't text me for days, right? Or, somebody's, saying that they are wanting to share their trauma, but then all of a sudden it's really hard for them to share. There's a confusion about trauma because it's such a shock to our bodies and to our brains that we don't even know how to cope with it. So it's not only confusion based off of the paradoxes, but one of the biggest components of it being a confusion for us, a source of confusion, is because it poses this big question, 3-letter word, but big question: why? Why do bad things happen? Why does suffering happen? Why does trauma happen? And this is confusing because we often have this image of the world, that the world must be fair, the world must be neat, livable, understandable, right? Cause and effect, right? And even we say like everything happens for a reason. It needs to be this neat, understandable world. But let me ask you this. What would you say to, I'll give you different scenarios. What would you say to Mary, who was recently raped? I want you to think about that for a second. What would be your response? Mary comes to you and says, I've been raped. Okay, think about what might you say, right? So maybe you have some anxiety creeping up of like, oh my gosh, what do you say? Now, think about not only, what would you say if she was raped? Well, actually, if you have any comments, feel free to put it in the chat of what might you say. But I at least want you to think about what might be your response. Now, the scenario changes. What would you say to her if she was raped multiple times? Now, the reason why I give this scenario B is often we might have an okay response to she was, the first time. We might say, oh, actually sometimes we're really bad sometimes we'll be like, oh, well, things happen for a reason, but then also when it comes to being raped multiple times, we start sometimes insinuating that it's something that Mary is doing to be raped. And the reason why we do that is because in our brain, again, we have this idea of a world of cause and effect. So if Mary is raped multiple times, cause and effect, something she must have done, right? Because the idea or the belief that things happen for no reason, that's scary. We want to have a world that's like controllable. Oh, I did this, therefore I got this. Oh, it's because I was at the club. That's why I got sexually assaulted. What would you say to her if she's hopeless and suicidal? Sometimes people jump to, that God doesn't want you to have those thoughts, or you need to pray those thoughts away. Oof, right? What would be your response? And I hope that what you're realizing is that it's really hard to know what to say. Often we say the wrong thing. And here's another scenario for you. Robert and Susie, a young couple in their 30s, have a miscarriage. What would you say to them? And I love some of the responses. People are saying that, I would listen. I would tell her that what happened to her was wrong and not her fault, right? I like that. Just, it's wrong. Like, God didn't design for this to happen, right? We live in a broken world. Listen, but I'll try to make sure she's safe. What would you say to Robert and Susie who just had a miscarriage? So you notice there I put that they're in their young 30s. A lot of times, one of the things I hear the most, oh, you're young. You can have more children. You have time. Oof. Why is that a wrong response? Maybe it's true. Maybe they can have another child. But why is that a wrong response? Okay, some people said that they would grieve with them. Yes. Because they're still grieving. It minimizes their pain. It's dismissive. It invalidates their experience. It's ignoring their pain. Spot on. Now, what would you tell them? Same scenario. If you knew that they were using cocaine during the pregnancy. Do you notice how our brain starts jumping to, oh, cause and effect? Oh, now I know why, right? When we start asking the question, why do bad things happen? A lot of us want to jump to, oh, I need to find an answer for why that happened. So some of you may be familiar with the book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. If you haven't read it, it's a great book. Again, I don't agree with everything. A rabbi actually wrote the book. And so there's some theological things that are not accurate, but he wrote the book, and I'll just read this and then tell you more about the context of it. And he says, like most people, so he's a rabbi, very strong in faith. He says, I was aware of the human tragedies that darken the landscape. He was aware of the young people who died in car crashes, the cheerful, loving people wasted by crippling disease, the neighbors and relatives whose retarded or mentally ill children people spoke of in hushed tones. He was aware of suffering, right? But that awareness never drove me to wonder about God's justice or question his fairness. I assumed he knew more about the world than I did. And that's kind of a cop-out that we do as Christians. Oh, I don't really, things happen for a reason. God knows. God knows. It says here, then came that day in the hospital when the doctor told us about Aaron. Aaron is his son, and explained what progeria meant. So his son was diagnosed with progeria, which is basically rapid aging. So if you think about rapid aging, it's basically, he describes it as every birthday is 1 year closer to his death. Yeah, someone put your Benjamin Button. So every second, every moment that's passing, they know that they're getting closer and closer to his early death. And so he says, I was aware of suffering, but then came that day in the hospital when the doctor told us about Aaron and explained what progeria meant. It contradicted everything I had been taught. I could only repeat over and over again in my mind, this can't be happening. It's not how the world is supposed to work, right? Because the world, good things happen to good people, right? If I'm serving the Lord, things aren't supposed to happen to me. If I'm wearing the right clothes, I'm not going to be raped. We have this image of the world. This can't be happening. Tragedies like this happen to selfish, dishonest people whom I, as a rabbi, would then try to comfort by assuring them of God's forgiving love. How could it be happening to me, to my son, if what I believed about the world is true? And many of you, if you are judgmental to people, often it's because you have not experienced trauma for yourself. Because like this rabbi, he said, oh, I have these nice views of the world and nice views about God, but until you experience trauma or have a very personal experience with trauma, your world belief is not going to change. Oh, it's nice and neat and livable and controllable. The world is nice. For myself, I often wrestle with God when I hear my clients' stories. I'm not like, oh, yes, I have an answer of why that happened. I'm like, why, God? It is so hard to grasp when you're actually confronted with the reality of trauma. And that's why we don't want to talk about it, because we don't have answers. The confusion of the complexity, we don't have answers to the why question. Then another reason why we don't talk about trauma is the diffusion of iniquity. And what I mean by that is Satan diffuses the shame, and that shame leads to silence. So what is shame? Any thoughts in the chat? What do you think? What is shame? There are many different definitions, and I'll reference one definition that's the most common definition. But what do you think is shame? And one thing I appreciate about our church in the last, so I've been in psychology for maybe the last 10 years. When I started in my field, we didn't talk about this at all. Even in the last, I would say 5 years, we are talking more about shame and guilt and trauma. And we're having conferences and forums like these. So I appreciate that we're finally talking about it, but it's often been silenced. So some people here are making some comments, profound sense of ugliness. When you do something bad and personify it as who you are. Yeah, that's a great definition, right? The difference between guilt and shame. Guilt is I've done something bad, versus shame is personifying it. Feeling bad like what you did or what happened to you is because you are bad or dirty, inward focused. Yeah. Shame is holding on to bad things and make it seem like it's our identity. I am bad because I did X or Y happened to me. Feeling dirty. Yes, excellent responses. So this is from Brene Brown. She's one of the leading researchers on shame. She says shame is an intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. And a lot of people conceptualize shame as a emotion, but shame is much more than emotion, right? And I like how she says here, or experience, right? Because a lot of you are alluding to this, it's a sense of identity, right? If it's just an emotion, I can cope with emotion. If it's just something I did, I could, change what I did or ask for forgiveness. But if it's who I am, how do I change who I am? That's my identity. And so shame causes silence, right? And we know that shame also and secrecy results in more behaviors that we don't want to engage in. Now, what's the purpose of shame, right? What another way to ask this is, why do you think Satan, right, tempts us with shame? Any thoughts? Why do you think, what's the purpose of shame? What's the scheme, Satan's scheme behind shame? To keep us from God, definitely. To make us feel unworthy and not accepted by God. You notice that with trauma, yes, isolation. you notice there's a couple of things here. And the book by Judith Herman, Trauma and Recovery, highlights some of these things. But the perpetrator, through shame, silences the victim. So this is fascinating. The perpetrator, if when something bad happens, you would expect that the perpetrator, oh, they did something wrong, right? Guilt, that would be highlighted. But actually, the perpetrator does, the act in a way that actually silences the victim, a lot of manipulation. And so the purpose of shame from a human perspective is to silence the victim so that the victim doesn't out the perpetrator. There's also the purpose of shame. Church silences victims. Church often is like, well, I don't know how to address that, so let's just not talk about it. So the church causes a lot of shame. We silence ourselves because of our own shame, right? And then Satan ultimately silences us, right? Because if we, right, with invisible wounds, if we are silent, like many people are referencing, we isolate. And can we find healing in isolation? No. What are some examples of shame in the Bible? I love the comments and I want to read them all. But what are some examples of shame in the Bible? Women at the well, Mary Magdalene, Tamar, the woman caught in adultery, Judas. I'm amazed someone hasn't mentioned the number one, the first story of shame. Adam and Eve, yes, Adam and Eve. If you study the story of Adam and Eve, you see Satan's purpose behind shame. He causes you to do something wrong, and then he causes you to feel ashamed about it. And the purpose of the shame, as you all have mentioned, what happened to them? They hid from God. Isolation, hiding, secrecy. Then shame also results in blame, right? And so Satan desires for us to hide and to be ashamed. So the last part of why are we talking about trauma, and I put this in all caps, because the Bible talks about it. It's fascinating that we don't talk about it when the Bible is full, absolutely full of trauma. So what are examples of bad things, suffering, and trauma in the Bible? Some of you have already mentioned a couple, right? Tamar, the story of Tamar. Wow, that's in the Bible? A rape story is in the Bible? What are other examples of trauma in the Bible? Whether physical, sexual, any type of trauma. What are examples of trauma in the Bible? Job, David and Bathsheba's baby, right? What would you tell David and Bathsheba, right? When they lost their child? Oh, well, you deserved it because, you had sex out of wedlock. Woman being chopped up, Hagar and Ishmael, Joab and Abishai witnessing their brother being killed, woman that was chopped up after being raped. Yeah, that's like, whoa, the Bible talks about that. I remember the first time I read that the Bible talked about when they were so desperate during invasion that they would boil their children and eat their children. I'm like, the Bible talks about trauma, right? Dinah, does anyone remember the story of Dinah or Dinah, right? The sister of Joseph, of the different, yes, someone's saying, yes, Dinah, how she was raped and taken advantage of, right? So a lot of different stories. So why do we talk about trauma? Because the Bible openly talks about it. Not only does it talk about it, but it answers these questions. Why do bad things happen? Why does suffering happen? Now, someone referenced Job. To me, it's no surprise, like when we think, oh, what's the first book written in the Bible? We think Genesis. No, the first book that was written was Job. Job is the oldest book. And that tells me that God wanted immediately for the human race to know the answers to these questions. Because, and it's kind of fascinating because even though we have the book of Job, we still don't fully study it and understand it. So let me give you an example. When we're going through trials and difficulties, does anyone know what's the number one quote that verse that we quote from Job when we're going through difficulties? Does anyone know? We say it like, oh, like Job, and though he slay me. That's another good one. Somebody put here, the Lord giveth and taketh away. That's actually a good one too. That though he slay me, right? Can anyone finish that? What do we say? Yet will I follow him, yet will I serve him, yet will I praise him. We say that whether it's the Lord giveth and taketh away or though he slay me, and that is completely wrong to say. Whoa, Katie, that's a strong statement. Why is that wrong? Is because in the heart of the purpose of the book of Job is to show you that God isn't slaying Job. The narrative of Job is to show that there's a great controversy between God and Satan. So we say, though he slay me. No, God is not slaying you. God is not responsible. So we have these I call them Bible band-aids of things we quote or say for deep wounds, but a tiny little band-aid doesn't do the job. And God didn't intend us to misquote scripture to help ourselves have a temporary comfort or help others, because temporary comfort results in long-term suffering. So the Bible answers these questions through the story of Job to show us that Job, right, suffered. Why? Because we live in a broken world. And in this broken world, there's a great controversy that is happening. And we are in the midst of it. So I'm not going to go through this in depth, but we see the Bible says, Revelation 12, that there's a war, and this war started in heaven, and then Satan is cast down. And so that war transfers from heaven to earth. And then in Genesis 3, it picks up, right? That then Satan and God were the main characters, but then in Genesis 3, we also become a main character, and Job is caught in the middle. Why do bad things happen? Not because Job did something wrong. So that's another part of Job that I love. The story of Job basically tells us not only that there's Satan and God, but it emphasizes in the very beginning, you can kind of highlight or circle the word blameless. Job was blameless. Job was blameless. Why is God emphasizing that? It's to show that we often would say, oh, if it didn't say that, oh, Job did something to deserve it, right? Job did, he must have not been worshiping enough. Maybe his children deserved it. Maybe he wasn't sacrificing for them enough. No, Job was blameless. And so the answer to why do bad things happen is because we live in a sinful, broken world, and we are in the midst of a great controversy. And you see these in these verses that we're in a spiritual warfare. And we have to stop thinking as human beings that as Christians, especially, that we're just here and we're just, living life. Well, trauma happens because we live in a broken world. So John 8:44 also says why it happens is because Satan, he was a murderer from the beginning. And I love this verse because it says he's not only a liar, he's the father of all lies, which means he not only murders, as in he not only causes the trauma, but one of the worst parts of trauma is not the trauma itself. People are like, what? Trauma is horrible. It is. But actually, people are really resilient. God gives us the ability to be resilient. The worst part of the trauma is actually the meaning that we give to it. And so he doesn't only try to destroy us, but the lies come afterwards. So I have patients who, when they were sexually abused as children, they carried the lie, it was my fault. I was too passive. I was overly developed for my age. I didn't say no. I didn't fight back. So Satan not only causes the trauma, but then suggests lies to us to keep us stuck in the trauma. He makes us believe that it's something that we're flawed, somehow we're flawed. He makes us believe that blame others and have resentment towards others. But most importantly, he suggests lies about who God is. We sometimes attribute the trauma to God, or we say, God didn't protect me, God doesn't love me, right? So he basically attacks us in many different ways. Another good verse to summarize this is John 10:10. It says, the thief does not come except to steal, to kill, and destroy. Satan wants to steal our joy. He wants us to kill us, literally. With trauma, actually, people who experience trauma often can live up to 2 decades shorter than people who don't experience trauma. So trauma can actually lead to premature death and to destroy us, to destroy our relationships, to destroy our relationship with God. I entitled this presentation Steal and Conceal, because that's really the main drive, Satan's drive behind trauma, is to steal our joy, to steal the joy that God desires for us by concealing the trauma, to have those invisible wounds. So the question then becomes, is there hope? Right? Is there healing? But John 10:10 doesn't end there. John 10:10 continues. It says, but I, Jesus, have come that they may have life and that they may have it more abundantly. And I love that. And I emphasize abundantly. This means overflowing. And we quote this verse. We often, especially with trauma too, we're like, oh, there's going to be a time with no more knife, no more pain. Heaven, let's aim for heaven. God's like, do not settle for heaven. I came that you may have life here and life more abundant now. Yes, I love it. Somebody put, God wants it now. But the only way to have it now is if you do not conceal those invisible wounds, but we start stepping out and talking about trauma collectively as a society, collectively as a church, and individually as well. And so our next presentation is entitled Kneel, Reveal, and Heal. And that's when we'll talk about how we can actually heal, how God desires for us to have that life and life abundant.
Dr. Elsen, I wanted to know, is there, or can we recognize when we have been healed from trauma? Is there any way to recognize that in our behavior?
So is the question is, how can we recognize if we've been healed from trauma?
Yes. Or is that even, are we ever really fully healed?
Yeah, that's a good question. So if you think about a wound, right? With a wound, if there's true full healing, right? You might still have a scar, right? You might still have the memory of the trauma. You might have some, certain an impact of it, but it's not a permanent limitation, and it doesn't cause you negative. It's not going to have a huge negative impact that an unhealed trauma has. So one thing I always emphasize with trauma is you will always have the memory. True healing doesn't mean that you don't have the memory, but the memory doesn't bring up the same arousal. It doesn't cause you the distress. It doesn't cause you the physical distress, the social distress, the all the different aspects that I covered. So it's always there, but it's kind of like that scar where you're like, oh, I remember that. I have a scar right here. I remember that. That was, when I jumped a fence and I, but it's not like, oh my gosh, it's still hurting. Oh my gosh, it's, causing me a lot of distress. So healing is definitely possible, but it's not this kind of delusion that we have that, oh, I don't remember it at all. It's, just out of my memory. It's there, but it doesn't cause the distress that it has in the past.
Awesome, thank you. We have two questions. The first question is, how do we reach out to a significant other who is dealing with trauma? And is it wise to continue dating or stop the relationship and lose the influence we have on them?
Okay. So I think there's two separate questions, how to reach out. And I'll talk more about this in the second series too, the importance of connection. We often try to say the right things, but what we actually desire as human beings, and think about it, if you are struggling and suffering, what do you want? You don't want somebody to say all the right things. You want somebody to just be there. And so how do you reach out? Reach out with sincerity, saying, I want to be there for you. And this is the best thing of the way to be there for somebody is ask them how would they like you to be there. Some people might say, I want a hug. Some people might say, I can't talk about it right now. Some people are like, no, I need to talk about it. And then if they want to talk about it or they want to work through it, also encouraging them to seek counseling, right? Because to kind of continue them on their healing journey. But there's not a one size fits all with how to help somebody with trauma. And so what I encourage you to do is to ask them, be like, I care for you. I want to be there for you. I want to be willing to talk about this with you. What is it that you want? What would be helpful to you? Okay, so that's the part A. Part B of the question is, when you ask, oh, will I lose my influence? If you're in a relationship with the intention of influencing the other, you need to be careful because you're not their therapist, right? In a relationship, you need two whole individuals in order to come together and have a healthy relationship. And so if there's an imbalance of you're helping the other person, and we think about that when it comes to, unequally yoked, right? I'm giving Bible studies to the other person. But that also happens emotionally. If you're emotionally at a place where you're trying to help the other person, you might consider whether pausing or, I don't know the situation with this person, but encouraging them to have healing, because that trauma, that baggage will not only impact your relationship, but it'll also impact your future. And so it's best to have healing now and to encourage healing now, whether or not the two of you are together in the future. But if you're concerned that, I might not have that influence, you might want to question whether or not that's a healthy relationship at this point.
Amen. Thank you. The second question was, what are ways to heal from shame?
Yes. So think about going, and I love the Bible because really the answers, one thing I encourage you to do is constantly go back to the Bible. Like, okay, the Bible talked about shame. What was the antidote for shame? If you look at Adam and Eve, right, we see that God pursued them, right? God came to them. And the way to heal from shame is they try to do it themselves, right? They try to cover themselves. So that's one thing of how not to heal from shame. Don't try it by yourself. Don't try it on your own. And then you see that God covers them. So if shame is nakedness in the story of Adam and Eve, and they try to cover themselves, then God instead covered themselves. So the question then becomes, what does that mean practically? Okay, the only way for my shame to be truly healed is by God covering me. So what that means practically is often shame, as we talked about, is the belief that I am unworthy, right? It's the belief that something's flawed with me. So the only way to heal from that is to change that belief. And changing that belief is recognizing that you are worthy, but not of your own merits, but through God. God created you in the image of God. So what's fascinating about that story of Adam and Eve is that Satan comes and tempts Eve to believe that she's not good enough. There's something that she's lacking. And because she believed that, even though, verses earlier, it says that she was created in the image of God. She lacked nothing. She was perfect. So the way to heal shame is by not focusing on yourself, but focusing on God. And you could do a study of when God clothes us, right? Zechariah 3 talks about God giving us, his righteousness. But the only way to heal from shame, those deep roots, and I'll talk about this actually next breakout session, part 2, is by adopting God's beliefs of myself for myself. Psychologists and other people will try to have you just kind of believe in yourself and have high self-esteem, but we're imperfect people. It's impossible. It's a temporary fix, but to a deeper problem, that the only way to have deeper healing is through recognizing God's worth and value for you.
Amen. Thank you. And the last question that we have is, what can we do if we handle it without going to extremes, trying to take care of our health because of trauma? I'm thinking, how can we handle it without going to extremes? Like, I don't know if he means smoking or drinking, or to take care of our health because of trauma. Oh, he added, like losing so much weight and have to wear extra clothes to cover up.
Okay. Can you repeat the question?
Yes. What can we do to handle trauma without going to the extremes while trying to take care of our health?
So I'm going to kind of defer to part 2 on that, because I'll talk about, basically we'll take a multifaceted approach of what can I do behavior-wise, things I can do, what do I do with my thoughts, what do I do with my emotions, and what do I do with my deep beliefs about myself. And so I'll just kind of encourage you, a little cliffhanger, right, to come back for part 2. But really, I just want to say this to close. This presentation is helpful to kind of be more aware of trauma, but it's incomplete, right? You need to come back for part 2 in order to fully understand, well, how do we, yes, part of healing is talking about it, but what else can I do, right? Not only for myself, because most of us, as we talked about, have experienced trauma, but also then how can I be able to help others who are also experiencing trauma?